Romans 11. And let's go back and grab chapter 10. In 10:5, Paul makes an interesting comment by going back to Leviticus, I think it's 18:5, and quoting the verse that says, if a person does these laws, he will live. What Paul is doing is, again, trying just to say we are telling the Old Testament story still, even here in the New Testament, that if a person, this is coming from Leviticus 18, were to follow Torah, he will live as opposed to perish. Okay? Again, nothing in the Old Testament, anywhere in the Old Testament, gives the reader the impression that the law was too hard to do. David celebrated the law in the Psalms continually, never complaining that it was impossible. So I'd recommend it's just a misunderstanding to turn that around in the New Testament and have someone like Paul in any way complain that the law was undoable. But then we would come to 10:4, and we have this interesting point that Paul again makes, that when you think about it, the purpose of the law is Jesus. Now he uses that Greek word telos. We've talked about this before. It's often translated as end, but it does mean purpose. So 1 Timothy 1:5, the telos of the commandment is love out of a pure heart. Now, again, it can be translated as end because of a verse like 1 Corinthians 15:24. Then comes the end, or the telos of history. But usually it has this concept of a fulfillment, or there's a reason why Torah exists, and it is, in Paul's estimation, 10:4, Jesus himself. Which then makes an interesting point that 10:3, backing up one more verse, Paul makes the comment that there is this possible problem that can happen, where a Jew will try to follow the law, and if they don't worship Christ, they will misuse the law. So even though a Jew is following the very thing that God said will make him live, if they don't follow it with the purpose that it had, it will end up not serving its purpose. It would be like a map going to a destination, and someone misreading the map, loving the map, but misreading it. So the idea is you can see it coming. Why would we even have to use Torah if the purpose of Torah is Jesus and the Gentile goes straight to Jesus without Torah? Will that work? And of course, Paul will say, this is part of his larger argument, yes, logically, everything will be just fine. And again, this all fits the Old Testament story. Continuing in Romans 10, he quotes from Deuteronomy 30, and I've quoted from it several times lately. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea to us, for us, and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. Again, that's Old Testament, Deuteronomy 30. And it's just saying, don't complain that this is too hard, these laws. They are really almost, you could say, common sense at base. So the story is simple then, and it's going to be just as simple now, if not even more. And here comes that famous passage in 10:9 and 10. If you, either one of these persons now, confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus. Jesus is Lord, the shortest creed of the New Testament. If a person says with their mouth, Lord Jesus, which again in that day, a claim out of the mouth was tantamount to a promise or a contract, as it were. If you confess with your mouth, Lord Jesus, and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So notice again how, as opposed to deeds doing, kosher, circumcision, Sabbath, those kind of things, it's as simple as a person's mouth and heart to simply say the truth about Jesus. Both that he is the Lord of the cosmos and that God has put him in a position through the resurrection of being the Son of God and over men and gods. So this, again, think of the Old Testament. My favorite story of conversion in the Old Testament is Joshua 2:11, where Rahab says, "Your Elohim Yahweh is God of heaven and God of earth." She was making a statement with her mouth. She believed it with her heart. So salvation of Joshua 2, salvation of Romans 10, it's the same means, it's the same story once again. Well, then when you get to the second half of chapter 10, we're simply restating the non-partiality of God in various ways. Verses 20 and 21, regarding Gentiles, I was found by those who did not seek me. I was made manifest to those who did not ask for me. Regarding Israel, all day long God said, I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. So just the very thing you wouldn't expect you get on both ends, that Jews were given the law and they didn't get Jesus. Gentiles were not given the law and they did get him. So a lot of opposites happening. Coming into chapter 11, Paul asks as a Jew, well, what about my people? What about my people? How are they going to be saved then in the end? Is the promise of God going to be true? Well, he quotes Elijah back in 1 Kings 19 when he said, yet have I reserved, or God says to Elijah, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Paul was nervous that the Jews as a people, of course, were not following Jesus here in this book, and he remembers how Elijah had said, oh God, my people are so disobedient and idolatrous, and God said, well, I've got 7,000 who are still with me. So Paul uses this idea, and here comes that concept of, we saw in the Old Testament, and we'll see it now, used the idea of a remnant, or the leftovers. Is there not a remnant according, Paul says, in today's story now in Romans, there is a remnant according to the election of favor. Back in the Old Testament, we had a remnant that did not bow to Baal. Now we have a remnant that is being chosen by God by mere favor. Who is that remnant? Listen to how, again, we are reminiscing back on 9, 24, and 25, when we're seeing that the remnant is of the Gentile and of the Jew. Add these two groups together, and coming out of that group are believers in Jesus, and only believers in Jesus then would be considered the remnant in today's New Testament term. Well, the rest of chapter 11 is spoken of in front of both Jews and Gentiles who could have a sense of antagonism and bitterness that goes into the church or church life there. And so Israel's failure to believe in the Messiah, moving then the message to Gentiles, you see how that could engender both pride on the part of Gentiles and frustration on the part of Jews. So in the end, again, as we're coming close now to chapters 12 to 16, which is all about peace in the church, the Jews and the Gentiles need to see themselves as one family, under one title. And in fact, this is what Paul says in 11:26, and so all Israel will be saved. Well, we can call them all Israel, Paul would say, provided we're able to redefine what Israel means.